Yeah, we want to be acknowledged for what we do, but also every single thing we do stands on the shoulders of every other artist involved in the production from day one. So if we go and say, okay, this movie is wildly successful because of my brilliant color grade, what are we saying about the director and the DP? And that, I think, is something that gets lost in a lot of beginner colorists or even advanced colorists. Sometimes you look at something and you're like, I need to change this so drastically. I want that feeling of bypass button turn on and off and see a really big change, right? And you can get into this loop of like, oh, I didn't do enough. This doesn't feel different enough. Well, it doesn't always have to. It's easy to take an attitude of, well, I'm the final say and I'm going to put my handprint on this. Some stuff, some projects need that. Others don't.
Welcome to Color and Coffee, a podcast that's focused on the craft of color and the artist behind it. I'm your host, Jason Bodak, and each episode we'll sit down with some of the most talented artists in the industry and have a casual chat from one artist to another. We'll share their stories, their insights, their tips, and of course, their beverage of choice. Whether you're a seasoned pro or just getting started, join us for some great color discussion. Sit back, grab your mug. You're listening to Color and Coffee. Hi, I'm Jason Bodak, and welcome to this episode of Color and Coffee. I'm so excited to introduce you to today's guest, Joey Deanna. He's a talented colorist and an HDR finishing specialist working in the Washington, D.C. area at DC Color. Beyond his expertise, Joey is a fervent educator, frequently sharing his insightful tips and discussing technology on sites like Mixing Light and his own podcast, the Offset Podcast. Joey has had the pleasure of working with material from Nat Geo, Food Network, Discovery, OWN Network, BET, and TLC. Thank you so much for joining us today, Joey.
Thanks for having me.
Now, let's jump to possibly one of the most important questions we have on this episode. What are you drinking today?
Black coffee. I pretty much exist solely off black coffee. I quit drinking a few years back, so now the only fluid intake I have is either black coffee or water, pretty much.
Well, first off, congratulations on quitting drinking. That's certainly no small feat. And it seems like you replaced one diuretic with another.
Well, I always had the coffee. I've always drank lots of black coffee. Now it's just the primary source of nutrients in my life.
Now, I have to ask you, I tend to have my coffee with quite a bit of creamer. What leads you to black coffee?
I actually like the taste of coffee. I firmly believe that if you don't like coffee black, either you're getting really bad coffee, and not to be a snob about it, I'm drinking straight up McDonald's coffee right now, you know? They brew it all day. They're pretty good at it. You know, you don't have to be a snob about coffee, but if you really like the taste of coffee, you get used to really enjoying it black. It's kind of like steak, right? If you don't like your steak medium rare, you probably don't actually like steak because there's a correct way to consume it. I believe the same for coffee. I'm also very opinionated.
It's very true. We could definitely go on about the steak conversation, but I'm drinking I switched over. It's summertime now, so I've switched over to my iced coffee. I'm drinking Cameron's iced coffee here with, as I mentioned, quite a bit of almond milk. So we're on the different ends of the spectrum here.
I also drink iced coffee completely black, which you go to any coffee shop, any place, and you ask for a black iced coffee, you've never seen somebody more confused by 3 words in their life. It's like they've never heard of it, and I don't understand it because it's delicious.
I'm so happy that I was able to ask you that today because maybe I'll have to try black coffee more often. It's something that I can adapt to. I used to have a lot more sugar in my coffee. I've started to pour back on that. I love coffee, but it's something I think I've gotten, maybe it's the sugary drinks, the frappuccinos and stuff.
Yeah, I won't touch them. I won't go anywhere near them. If I want ice cream, I'll just have some ice cream. There's nothing wrong with that.
100%. Well, I wanted to invite you on the show because you are a really unique individual. Not only are you really attuned to what's going on in the industry in terms of HDR and training, but you are a really, really talented colorist. So I first wanted to jump in and get a little bit about your background. How did you get into being a colorist? And I believe you were an online editor first?
Yeah. So I started, it's funny, every time I talk about this, I feel like I talk about, at this point in my career, most of what I discuss is, wow, I'm old, because I started back in the linear editing days. I actually kind of grew up in a post house. My dad was a broadcast engineer in various places around town here. I mean, I'm based out of DC, so obviously we're a huge, huge news town. So my dad worked at CBS. Then he worked at an international broadcasting engineering firm that he had founded. And then from there, him and some partners founded a post house in DC. And that post house ended up becoming, for a time, the largest post house in the region. That was about when I came on, when we were building that facility. My first big project in the industry was running cable, putting BNCs and XLRs on things, wiring decks in the core, putting together linear suites, and literally running the cables from point A to point B based on the documentation on the engineering charts. From there, I started to learn the linear suites. And once the facility became operational, I was still primarily in an engineering role, whether it was doing video engineering, fixing suites, messing with tape decks, things like that, troubleshooting. But also, it was right at the beginning of the world of computers coming into this industry. And I was young, I was great with computers. Most of the old guys there were not so great with computers. So I was kind of the de facto computer resource for this growing post house, where computers every day were becoming more and more, okay, now it's just email. Well, now we're emailing files. How do we get those files into the linear suite to be an image of a logo with FTP into a Chiron? We got to put servers in now. We got to host our own things for posting things for clients. And then as the nonlinear world grew, obviously we went into nonlinear finishing, so now we got to manage all these complicated nonlinear computer systems. I came at it from an engineering background, doing computers, doing some broadcast engineering, but I was always fascinated by the bright lights and buttons and all the cool stuff that these guys were doing in these suites. So I hung around in the linear suites. We had a very good mentoring environment. There were a few editors there, online editors, because everything was offline in the low-res Avids at the time. They were running AVR3, so imagine, I think, 640 by 480 single field to do your creative edits. And then we would go in with the EDL on a floppy disk and assemble from the tapes the master edit at full resolution. That was where my focus was hanging out with those guys, doing the online edits, learning every single thing you could about every single piece of equipment in that room, because everything was its own box. It wasn't all in one program. You had the switcher, DME, mixer, edit controller, all of those things. And eventually, like I said, it was a great mentoring environment to grow up in. And that made a huge difference in getting me into the chair quickly as an online editor. And then from there, as the online suites, the linear online suites went away pretty quickly, because, like I said, we were evolving into computers at this time. We got our first discrete smoke. We got our first Avid Symphony.
I was going to ask, approximately what software were you working on around this time?
We got our first Avid DS.
There we go.
And all of those together, I moved into nonlinear online very, very quickly. Partially because I'm a computer nerd. I saw the big SGI machines for the smoke. I was like, this is awesome. And then I started to learn all these systems. We had a very wide breadth of online systems at the time. At the peak of it, we probably had, after we got rid of the linear suites, we had discrete smoke, Avid DS, Avid Symphony, and Quantel EQ. And then later, Final Cut Pro in all different workflows and environments. And I learned every single one of them. I took an attitude of, I'm going to learn how to do online editing, and then abstract that from the actual what button does what on which system. So I became kind of like the go-to resource of, we have a session scheduled in the smoke and we don't have a smoke operator to run it. Joey can fit in there. EQ session, Joey can fit in there. DS session, Joey can fit in there. I could run every single box in the facility, which made me pretty versatile as an operator and as an artist. And from there, every single online session had a little bit of color work involved. And then as technology marched forward even more, we got into digital cinema, right? Early in the days of HD, everybody was shooting display referred, right? We were shooting on Sony HDW 750s, HDW 900, HD cameras, or HDV that was shooting Rec 709 baked into the camera. So anything online edit, you were doing basic color corrections or color effects for creative reasons, but we weren't doing telecine style color grading where we're coming from an intermediate format like RAW or log and developing the image. When we got the first project from the Red 1 camera, in that Quantel EQ suite, and I get these log images, and I'm taking Cineon transfers to transforms and LUTs to convert them into display space and figuring out, oh, this is kind of like a film negative. This is new for a video guy,
Mhm.
right? It's not new to the people that grew up on film, but for, an online video guy, digital cinema was a big shift. And that was where I was like, okay, color grading is the thing for me. I love this. This is where I need to focus. And as we know, digital cinema just expanded to be ubiquitous. Now everything almost is shot in an intermediate format of RAW or log and needs some kind of developmental process to get to a display format. So that was my focus. Is I went from engineering to online editing to basic color to color finishing for digital cinema. So it's been quite a journey.
Yeah, it sounds like a really interesting journey. And one of the things that I think you touched on that I'd like to dig into a tiny bit more is this evolution of operator to artist. It's one of the things that I've seen evolve in the industry. And it's one of the things that I heard in the way that you described your own background and evolution in your own self. So we have this evolution of how operators were seen as somebody that just touches buttons and operates the machine, like a machine room. And as we started to get into, I'll call it DI, we started to see a evolution more towards everybody seeing this as more towards artistry. Where do you see this starting to come in, and how do you see that affecting the industry going forward?
There's a very clear difference between a film background and a video background. We all got to the same place in the end, but from a video background like I am, in online editing, there wasn't a huge amount of creativity. And I don't mean that in a bad way. We were coming up with creative solutions to problems every day, but we were handed a floppy disk or emailed a file that had the creative edit decisions already all made, right? It was called an edit decision list. We were just putting together somebody else's creative decisions. And then once you got into more advanced color work, like I said, when we moved into digital cinema, you started to really feel like, okay, I'm actually putting something creative into this. The client can come in and say, okay, I want this kind of mood for this scene. I want to evoke this emotion, or you get a feel for how this character is or this background is, and you're manipulating the image in such a way that you're actually incredibly changing the creativity and the story just with color. And that was something we never really had in online editing. When that started happening in my career, that was when I really started to feel like, okay, this is a creative outlet as well. I've always loved photography just as a hobbyist. And to me, it felt like dealing with my own photography just on somebody else's photography. It was a bit of a light switch for me when we started doing the video equivalent of DI. That was when it went from mostly technical to highly creative, but also technical.
It's funny you call it, you had a light bulb or a light switch moment, because I also remember mine where I came from a VFX background, and I had this one day where I had, oh my goodness, I can get just as much creativity in the color grade as I can do in VFX, but nobody will actually notice it if I do my job correctly. And for me, that was even more intriguing and appealing.
I mean, especially with VFX, if you can convince somebody there's no VFX, it's the best VFX in the world.
Yeah.
And I feel the same way about color.
I think it's even more true for color, because the whole point is yes, with visual effects, you don't want anybody to notice it's a visual effect, but for some things you want people to notice that it's there, depending on what you're trying to do. But for color, I think the purpose is to always have it in the background, for you to feel it more than to notice it. And I think there is a craft to that. It's very difficult. And I think the audience has gotten much better at seeing the artifice around that when you force something onto our images.
Yeah, and I will say this, if you strive for credit and people noticing your work, maybe colorist isn't the job for you, because we want to be light-handed and not obvious. We want to fall into the background of the story and just make sense and be right. But nobody's watching this movie thinking, wow, I like the color grade on that skin tone on this shot. I mean, we all are, but your normal moviegoer or your normal television watcher isn't watching out for it unless something's bad.
100%. And I think that's when you've reached like the top area of your craft is when only you and other people that participate in that level of the craft are obsessing over it. And nobody else should really notice that. I think that's when you've hit a certain area of whatever your professional craft is, that nobody else except somebody at that level can really focus on that and appreciate it. And I think that's interesting. I think that's a positive thing. I think a lot of people see that as a negative. But there's so many thousands of people that work on a movie that expecting every single person to be in the spotlight and to be expecting credit other than I'm happy to have contributed to that is unrealistic.
And it's a prickly subject for colorists because, yeah, we want to be acknowledged for what we do, but also every single thing we do stands on the shoulders of every other artist involved in the production from day one. So if we go and say, okay, this movie is wildly successful because of my brilliant color grade, what are we saying about the director and the DP? No, our job is to take our creative input with the client and make everything together as a cohesive, finished whole, respecting all of the artistry that went into every other medium of creativity to make this image. And that, I think, is something that gets lost in a lot of beginner colorists or even advanced colorists. Sometimes you look at something and you're like, I need to change this so drastically. I want that feeling of bypass button, turn on and off and see a really big change, right? And you can get into this loop of like, oh, I didn't do enough. This doesn't feel different enough. Well, it doesn't always have to. You know, it's about balance. And as the last stage in the process, you know, like I said, growing up in the online edit world, I've always been kind of the last stage, the last eyes on something before it goes out to the world. And you got to be really, really cognizant of that because you are now dealing with every single other bit of artistry that went into producing this piece of media at the very end, and you're going to be the last person to touch it. I mean, it's a cool opportunity, but it's also a big, big, big responsibility. It's easy to take an attitude of, well, I'm the final say and I'm going to put my handprint on this. Some projects need that. Others don't. And I think a bit of self-awareness goes a long way. I'll be the first to admit I'm not perfect at the self-awareness aspect of it. And I've been doing this for 20 years. And it's like a lifelong pursuit to try to figure out that balance of how do you respect all the artistry that goes into every image that you're dealing with and do what's best.
I think that's one of the most important subjects that has been brought up on this podcast. We are essentially gatekeepers for this film. We're there to have a fine-tooth comb to look for things and bring it to the attention of the producers or people that are making the final decision. And it can be really appealing to want to have our own DNA, our own footprint on that. But these films can take 5, sometimes 10 years to produce. And I think it's almost a spoiled mentality to say, I'm going to have the last footprint. I'm going to make sure that my fingerprint is the last thing.
Yeah, we come into it at the very end and we, on the whole, commit the least amount of time in terms of the most major creatives. But we're coming into, in some cases, things that have been in people's lives for years or more. And we're spending a week, 2 weeks. We really got to be a little level-headed on what we do in that color suite.
I think it's also really important that we remember that our sensibilities are not other people's sensibilities. And color is something that, although we may have an eye for it, our eye is not other people's eye. And that we can have a preference for something. It may not be other people's preference. And to make sure that we check with others. I think it's really something that's easy to become overly confident about, that our preference is the same preference that everybody else has. Especially when you're starting out, it becomes really, really easy to become overly confident in your own preferences.
Yeah, I think one of the hardest skills for any colorist to learn, and I think this is a lifelong skill development issue, and you got to think about it a little bit, but you need to get really, really, really good at executing a good job of a grade or a style or a look that you might not like, right? The vision for a project, you might come into that project and say, well, I think it should be this. And the director and DP are like, no, this is our creative vision. You need to be able to execute that to technical and creative perfection, where every shot matches and flows, and they're looking at it and feeling like, yes, this is what I envisioned. The best projects, the most fun projects, you're on the complete same page. But all of this is subjective. You might not be. And you need to put your sensibilities aside sometimes. Use all your artistic talent to execute their vision that you may or may not prefer, but you still need to do it to the highest level, and you need to be committed to doing it to the highest level. You can't just be like, well, I think it should be this, and you're wrong. Who says it should be one thing or another? This is completely subjective.
I think being brave to try things out, like you were just mentioning, is how we can get into some of the new trends that we've been seeing. A lot of the times people get bored of looks or trends, but basically it's somebody has seen the teal and orange look or this mentality or the green and
I don't know
yellow
what
look.
you're talking about, but yellow and green are the new teal and orange, and I will die on that hill, and it's my greatest favorite thing ever.
I actually love it right now. And I think by one person or one artist being brave and saying, you know what? Let's go in this direction and see what happens. When one person is saying, I'm a little iffy about this, we can get new grades, new looks. And it just takes one person to be brave on a new project to say, wow, look at that. You know what? I really like that. And then it encourages other people to do that.
But that's got to be in lockstep creative agreement with the DP, the director, the producers, or they're going to resent you. If you put your stamp on that project in a way that they don't like, they're never going to like their own project. And that would be a shame.
You're 100% correct. I do believe that a well-executed color grade starts on set. It starts with production design. It starts with wardrobe. I do not think wardrobe is talked about enough, but you cannot color correct wardrobe to look good as much as you would like to. Wardrobe is a huge aspect of building a film. The way that it looks, the material that they choose, we can't fix that in the grade as much as I would like to.
Yeah, and it's funny because I'm kind of listening to myself talk here, and I feel like I'm really downplaying what we do, because I'm about to say the look is not made in the grading suite. I don't believe that it is at all, right? The look is made in front of the lens. It doesn't downplay what we do, but we need to be aware of that, right? Like you said, wardrobe matters so much more than so many things, and people don't even think about it. Production design matters so much. And of course, lighting. Lighting is probably the most important thing that's going to happen in the production process. And all of this comes together to give you all the ingredients you need to execute that vision, right? If you don't have those ingredients from the start, then you're working in like, I'm going to try to fix things and put something in that wasn't their land. And of course, sometimes that happens and sometimes it's necessary. But you look at some of the most stunning looking films you've ever seen, and this is an exercise I think everybody can do and look at. Find your favorite movie, your favorite grade, go on the internet and look up behind the scenes photos. Because those behind the scenes photos never went through the creative grading process. And I promise you, 9 times out of 10, they look pretty much like the movie. You know, there might be some aspects that were done in the grading suite and they might not be as refined, whatever. But the primary ingredients, you're going to see them in the BTS shots just as you saw them in the final product. And I don't think a lot of people really even think about that.
It's so funny because I've started to look at some of the higher end projects. I've seen some of the Marvel projects, and a lot of people assume there's going to be this major shift in the show LUT. And it's funny, the larger the projects, the smaller the shift I see. It really comes out of the camera looking very close, other than the VFX, to what you would expect, because they do all the work up front. They take their time on production design. They really make sure on set that they get whatever they need to. Yes, they're shooting with high quality lenses. Yes, they're shooting with high quality cameras, but they take that extra time to set things up, make sure the lighting is pointed in the correct direction, make sure that things are properly illuminated, make sure there's a flag here, make sure there's not a flag here, make sure there's a balance where there needs to be. That stuff is worth it when you get into the color grade.
Yeah. And it matters so much. And like you mentioned the show LUTs, most of these big productions will run under a single transform or a single show LUT because they monitor with that on set. So they expect it to be pretty consistent through the entire production and post-production process. And yeah, if you look at some of these transforms or LUTs that they're using, they're pretty simple because the color scientists of the world have figured out very good display transforms for most display mediums these days, and they can be tailored to the creative needs of the project, and they don't need to be a heavy lift, and they shouldn't be a heavy lift because the more you contort that image, the more damage you're going to do to it. I think you're right. I think if people could get access to the show looks and show LUTs of major productions, they would be shocked at how technically simple they are in a lot of ways.
True. I think this is a perfect segment to move over to a subject that I'm really interested in, which is the introduction to HDR into a lot of shows and pipelines recently. Now, I know you are not only an advocate for HDR, but really a fervent trainer. I know you and Robbie Carmen were part of the Dolby Vision training videos. And I want to talk to you a little bit about not only the grading process for Dolby Vision, but what people can do to make working with Dolby Vision easier for us on set. Because we've been talking a lot about how the grading process is not really done in grading. We really rely on what's on set. And I think a lot of people have not really taken that mindset to HDR properly. I think a lot of us have assumed that, oh, a new display is just a new display. We can do everything in post. But I'd like to talk to you about things that people can do on set to make working in HDR easier.
I think the most important thing, in my opinion, when describing HDR and HDR workflows is, we've seen a lot of transition in the industry in the years. We went from black and white, at least in TV land, we went from black and white TV to color TV to HD TV to digital HD TV broadcasts. All of these things, we didn't drastically change the underlying technology for 100 years, right? We made it better, we improved it, but since the introduction of color, we haven't drastically changed how we capture, process, and display an image.
Mm-hmm.
HDR, and Dolby Vision in specific, is a fundamental change and reinvention of that process of capturing, processing, transmitting, and playing back an image. And the importance of that can't be understated because there's so many more factors involved in what the end viewer sees that if you don't understand that process from the beginning to the end, you can kind of get yourself into some problems. So like you say, that does start on set. You can light and production design a production for HDR the exact same way you would for SDR. There's nothing wrong with that if you're not planning on using that extended dynamic range dramatically in your final grade. I think a lot of early HDR stuff was a little bit overly cooked because people were like, we can go really bright now. Let's do it. Let's make everything really bright. Not everything really needs to be really bright. And that impacts your lighting ratios. If you've got somebody looking down at camera with a big bright window behind them, now that we've got HDR displays, we can display that entire dynamic range. Is that a creative good idea? It might not be for your production. So you might want to put a flag on that window or add extra light to get that ratio tighter from the talent to the window so they aren't so far apart. You don't want to drastically change shooting contrast ratios in post, whether you're in HDR or SDR, because you get into this issue of we're trying to compress small regions of the image spatially where you kind of get that glowing look of the multiple exposure bracket HDR photos that were very trendy for a while, because those were bracketed HDR, then compressed down for an SDR display.
Yeah.
So you have the entire wide tonal range just squished down and it doesn't look natural at all. So lighting ratios, I think, is just as important in HDR as it was in SDR. And that's where a lot of people go wrong first, is we have these huge dynamic range cameras. No matter what format we're delivering to, we can capture all this dynamic range. It's great. We don't need as tight of a lighting ratio. Well, you kind of do in most cases, unless you want really distracting highlights or underexposed talent or underexposed foregrounds. Because yes, we can capture this dynamic range. Even in HDR displays, you can't always display that much. And even if you can, like that example of the window, is the bright window the creative focus of the shot?
Yeah.
And should it be grabbing that much of the viewer's eye by that brightness? In most cases, the answer is no. In some creative reasons, it might be. A dramatic silhouette effect could look amazing in HDR. And in that case, you might want to light with a higher contrast ratio. But those are the kind of things where HDR monitoring on set, I think, can make the biggest difference in the world, because like we talked about earlier, display transforms have gotten really, really, really good. So you might be looking at preview LUT on set in SDR, and because the highlight roll off of that transform is really elegant, you might be like, this is perfect, this is great. But then you look at it in HDR, you're like, oh, that window is going to be a little too hot. Now we're going to have to really dramatically adjust that in post, we might want to put some film down on that window to knock it down a little bit. So HDR monitoring on set is a huge, huge, huge asset. It doesn't have to be all of your monitoring. Obviously, you don't need HDR monitoring to look at framing, but having a good master HDR reference monitor on set, kind of in your video village. Now, here's where it gets hard, right? Because you got to have a dark environment. You got to let people adjust their eyes too. You can't just walk into the tent, look at the HDR monitor and be like, that's too bright, that's too dark, walk back out of the tent when you're in daylight, right? Your eyes need like 5 minutes to adjust, and you need to be aware of that when you're making these decisions. So having the monitoring on set, I think, is very helpful, but you also got to be kind of aware of the limitations of it. And HDR or SDR, the fundamentals of lighting design, of contrast ratios, and of how much light is here or there, and light metering and stuff like that, that all still applies. So the DP can still kind of bring their artistry to it in the same way they always have. Great to have an HDR preview monitor to look at to kind of give you an idea, but trust traditional photography principles as much as possible as well. I know I'm kind of conflicting myself a little bit there almost, but it does matter.
I think it's valid. My next question for you is, what do you feel about using things to soften highlights? Because I mean, I've noticed things, I have issues with things like sconces and knives edges and things that I'd never ever think about in SDR. Things that will turn into specular highlights in HDR that would never have that issue in SDR. What are your suggestions for that?
Yeah, that's one of those things where it's like, again, we fundamentally reinvented how the image is being transmitted and displayed. So what wasn't a problem is a problem. In HDR, nothing clips, right? Unless you intentionally clip it, because we don't have any 10,000 nit displays. In SDR, when you get really, really bright, the worst that it can ever happen is it turns to 100% white. That doesn't hurt your eye very much. It doesn't objectively like make you kind of jump back and be like, what is that? In HDR, nothing clips until you get to 10,000 nits, which, like I said, is far away in the future, if it ever will even happen. So, if you look at a parade scope of an HDR signal, there is no top. So what is white? White's now a relative target, just like it is in the real world, which means if it gets really bright and there's like kind of different differential in color balance, your speculars could go pink or go blue. And you might not be aware of that until they pop up. Like the example you had, like on a knife edge or something, that specular could have some color in it that you might not want, or you might want to put in. The other interesting thing about PQ HDR specifically, again, back to this is a fundamental reimagining of the technology. The brighter you go in PQ, the less color precision you have. The less luminance precision you have. So the amount of code values from 0 to 100 nits is about half the signal. From 0 to 1,000 nits is like the next, I think, like 40% of this or 30% of the signal. Don't quote me on these numbers. But as you get brighter and brighter and brighter, the steps between those brightnesses reduce. And that's important to remember. Now, that's by design, because as you get brighter, your ability to discern those steps visually gets worse and worse and worse. That's why PQ stands for the perceptual quantization curve, right? It's based on human perception. But what that kind of means in a digital signal is if you try to put great amounts of detail in 2,000 nits, 3,000 nits, even 4,000 nits, that detail will turn to banding and chunking and messiness. And the further down the encoding pipeline you get, the worse that gets, right? Gotcha. So it's one of those things to just be aware that you will not get incredibly high detail images in those brighter areas. They are for small speculars, and they work great for small speculars. But just the nature of it is we don't see huge detail in big, bright things. I don't recommend looking right at the sun, but if you do, I promise you, you're not going to perceive a smooth gradated image. You're going to perceive the same thing applies to PQ on a much smaller scale. So it's an interesting HDR only challenge. Because like I said, in SDR, the worst thing it goes to 100% white, which looks kind of okay in most cases.
Yeah, and you get that little highlight glow that a lot of people find very pleasing.
Yeah. So I would say recommendations can go anywhere from managing the color balance of those highlights, because again, remember, you're not clipping channels.
Mm-hmm.
Managing the amount of contrast in those highlights, because you're not having enough precision there. And also think about, I like to desaturate the brighter speculars a little bit. I think that works in HDR really, really well, because again, it's the natural tendency we're used to in SDR, where the brighter you go as the channels clip, the less saturated it gets. There's no color information there. You can kind of emulate that in your HDR grade and make those highlights look softer as they get less and less saturated to that bright peak. But that takes some intentional work in HDR, where in SDR it was just a natural, evolution of how the format worked.
I want to dig into a little bit of a nerdy topic right here, because I don't think this one's covered a lot, and I know you happen to be an expert on this. So I know a ton of people are using WOLEDs. And for those that are not aware, WOLEDs are the panels that are used by LG's consumer-based TVs. The C series, the G series, those are WOLEDs. And while they are very good displays, they are not great for professional use because they do not go all the way up in the luminance range. And I wanted to ask you for an explanation of why you would not recommend them for professional work, because I thought it goes really well with the discussion we just had.
Yeah, and it's all based in that exact highlight behavior that I just described. You misspoke a little bit. They do go up in luminance. They don't go up in what's called color volume. Now, what I mean by that is the WOLEDs work. They get brightness by pushing in a white pixel, right? So you've got red, green, and blue pixels that are OLED that can dim all the way down to zero. So that's why you get your great contrast. But the brighter you get, that white pixel starts to come in and brighten it up. Now, from a display perspective, it's not technically wrong. It looks phenomenal. You get these bright, high contrast images with rich color in the tonal ranges where we're really looking for it. Like I said, the bulk of the code values in PQ are between 0 and 100 nits. You've got full RGB color in that entire region on these WOLEDs. But what happens when you get to bright colors? Now, remember, I said HDR channels don't really ever clip, so you can have super specular highlights with very dramatic color tints. Well, what happens in a WOLED is the brighter you get, the less saturated you get. And it happens in a very weird nonlinear manner. So you might go to 1,000 nits or even 300, 400 nits. Your specular highlights are going to naturally and non-linearly get less saturated because of that white pixel. The reason why nobody buys these TVs and says, man, I wish I had more color volume, is because as a end user display, the failure behavior of that color volume collapse is very aesthetically pleasing. I just recommended desaturating your highlights in your HDR grade to do the same thing this display is doing naturally, right? So the displays look amazing and your grade can look amazing on them, but your grade will only ever look amazing on them because there are wide swaths of the HDR signal that those monitors cannot physically reproduce, which means you could grade a whole show and your specular highlights could be neon pink the whole time, and you would never, ever know if that was the only display you were working on. And guess what? Not all HDR displays are WOLEDs. So once that piece of creative moves to any full color volume HDR display, active dimming, LCDs, quantum dot OLEDs, whatever, which a lot of the consumer landscape is not WOLEDs, guess what? It's going to look terrible, and you would have never known because you never saw the entire signal. That's why we talk about reference monitoring, because it is a reference to the standard. We're showing the entire signal accurately. The WOLED can't do that. Now, this has been a sticking point in the industry for a while, I think, because a lot of colorists bought these WOLEDs, and a lot of colorists were like, well, I'm the colorist, I have super good eyes, I'm amazing. There's this emotional attachment to these WOLEDs. Like, I've talked to so many colorists that think that they have the one magical WOLED that their guy calibrated and it's so good and perfect that they can get away with it. But no, there's wide swaths of the image that it can't display, and you would never know if it was in your signal. Now, does that mean you can't use it as a preview? You can't practice HDR on it? You can't start an HDR grade on it? Absolutely not. The margin here is very, very small. The bulk of the image will be shown correctly on those OLEDs. My recommendation, if you are, by whatever circumstance, forced to work into a WOLED environment, this happened during COVID a lot. People would do entire shows, entire seasons of really big ticket properties on these WOLEDs. All you need to do is a final trim pass on a full color volume display. 99% of your grade isn't going to change. You're just looking for those little things that WOLED couldn't show you. That can be on the lowest end, an iPad Pro. An iPad Pro is a very good HDR display, and while it might not be perfect reference quality, it will show you what the WOLED couldn't show you, which is color volume collapse in those highlights. Or a lot of people, they would have, a lot of facility colorists would spend 2 weeks at home on a WOLED, go in for 1 day
Yeah, for a
on
trim pass.
the reference monitor, do a watch down and a final little tweaky trim, and then you're golden. I know I've been pretty emphatic about not using the WOLEDs for grading. I want to be clear. I mean, not using only the WOLED for grading. They make great client monitors too, because guess what? Failure mode of that color volume collapse is very aesthetically pleasing.
And that was one of the reasons I wanted to have you explain that, is I think it's a really interesting accidental failure. And I think the fact that it's failing, and I don't even know if failing is the right word, I think it's sort of breaking in a pleasing way, is an unfortunate situation for us that we've turned into a positive. But not understanding that information, I think, is hurting a lot of colorists. There's nothing
wrong. And for
a
consumer display, it's great. Mm-hmm. The consumer will look at it and all HDR content will look amazing on it.
And that's amazing. But I think exactly like you said, for those using it as a reference monitor, it's a false sense of security. There's nothing wrong with using it.
A lot of people, the other argument I get, besides the imaginary, well, my LG OLED is the super magic one, and I know it's perfect. Besides that argument, the argument I get is, well, what if I stay below like 300 to 400 nits? I don't need to have super brightness. That white pixel starts the second you get above 100 nits. It gets worse at brighter luminances, but that color volume collapse starts creeping in at the very beginning. And like I said, it's very nonlinear and very unpredictable. So you can't really model around it in a calibration. And even if you could, you couldn't get it to display those values anyway. So it's risky business. It's not just, oh, I need to tone down and not do an aggressive HDR grade. It's, you got to be aware that there's wide swaths of the signal that you can't see and will never see on those displays because they physically cannot reproduce that brightness and wavelength of light.
So that's really good info. For those working on the WOLED based displays, go ahead and do a short trim pass on a full color gamut display to make sure that you aren't missing anything. So it's really, really good info. Thank you so much for explaining that so clearly, Joey.
And I know it comes off as a little bit elitist when I'm sitting in front of a, 3000 nit full reference monitor, but it doesn't have to be elitist. As the technology's evolved, obviously we've seen the cost of HDR mastering go down. We've seen the cost of Dolby Vision mastering go down dramatically, and consumer HDR displays have gotten dramatically better. For a lot of people, that watch down check could just be an iPad Pro. And fun thing to do, look at a bunch of shows, especially ones that were graded a little bit ago before display technology evolved, on an iPad Pro, and then look at them on your LG OLED and kind of compare them a little bit and watch the specular highlights. You might see some purple highlights that pop in where you're like, they didn't mean to do that, did they?
That'll be very interesting. I'm definitely going to do that. And as a perfect example of what you were saying, as I believe 1 year ago, a 30-inch HDR display was in the $30,000 range. And now this year, you can get a 30-inch HDR display from our sponsor FSI for the around $10,000 range. So we are seeing a significant drop. I mean, I'm having to keep my credit card somewhere
and
safe.
that display, the cheaper display, like the new quantum dot OLED displays, are technically superior in almost every metric.
So not only are they cheaper, but they're higher quality. So I expect that to continue to drop in price and continue to increase in quality and offer more varieties of size. Because right now we're stuck at 30 and 55, if I'm not mistaken.
What's interesting too is that for the longest time, the question wasn't HDR versus SDR. The question on a lot of post-production facilities' minds was 4K versus HD. I might not be ready to do a Dolby Vision mastering suite, but I'd like some 4K monitoring. Well, for the longest time, the only reference quality 4K monitors were also HDR reference monitors. So you could go from a really good SDR reference monitor, whether it be OLED or LCD, for 5-ish grand, maybe more, maybe 5 to 10, depending on when it was, because that pricing did fluctuate a lot for an HD reference quality monitor. You needed to go to 4K. Now you're up to 30 or 40, no matter where you look, whether you want HDR or not, because you're getting HDR because those are the only options. Now, with these quantum dot displays, like we mentioned, the Flanders XMP 310, their 31-inch offering, is around 11 or 12, depending on your region. It is a perfect 4K or UHD, HDR, SDR reference display, right around that price point where SDR reference displays used to be. That's a massive shift.
A third drop in price. So I would not be surprised to see them in the $5,000 range next year. That's me totally sort of ballparking it, but that's what we saw in the SDR range is about a drop.
Yeah, and now we're looking at HDR reference monitors that are similar price range to the best SDR reference monitors of the previous generation, which that's the first time that's happened since HDR happened.
It's finally starting to come mainstream. It's getting to the point where if you're buying new equipment, it really should be 4K HDR. There's no reason to buy HD anymore. It's time to start working in it if you haven't. And for those that have not started working in HDR, even if you don't have a monitor for it, you can start working with DaVinci remote monitoring on an iPad. It's time to start experimenting with it. Get your workflows and start testing things out, because everybody's going to start asking for HDR very soon, as you can see, whether it's in your professional clients or even if it's YouTube, because YouTube also accepts HDR just to upload it.
Instagram can do HDR.
Wow, I did not know that. If anybody wanted to find out more about you, Joey, where could we find you on the internet?
Best place right now is, like you mentioned early on, me and my business partner, Robbie Carmen, we host a podcast called The Offset Podcast. Go to theoffsetpodcast.com. It's got information on me, Robbie, all of our episodes, stuff like that. That's probably the best place. I'm also on basically any of the DaVinci Resolve or color grading forums. I'm pretty active on those, so you'll see me around.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time, Joey. It's been a real pleasure having you on the show. And for Color and Coffee, I'm Jason Bodak. Thank you guys for joining us. And until the next episode, happy grading. And that's a wrap. Be sure to follow us on Instagram, YouTube, and your podcast app of choice. Search for @Color&Coffee or @Color&Coffee Podcast and join the conversation. If you're using Spotify or Apple Podcast, please leave a review. Huge thanks to FSI and Pixel Tools for sponsoring the show. Until the next episode,